you've probably, how many of you in the room think you've heard quite a lot from me over the last couple of years, 2 or 3 years? Quite a lot. So you kind of know my philosophy and what I believe in and why I'm in politics and so on. So I'm very keen to get to questions as fast as possible. But before I do that, can I ask you a few questions? How many of you voted for Brexit? Okay, well that's a small minority. How many of you think we got Brexit? Yeah. How many of you were Conservative Party voters? Yeah, and how many of you voted Labour in the past? Actually, that's more Labour than we normally have. And it's good to see. Just one last question before I get going. How many of you are under the age of 40? No, you're definitely not under the age of 40. It's a minority, and I'm going to come to that. One of the questions, in fact, that I was asked earlier, beforehand to answer is, why it is we don't attract young people. And it's a very, very good and important question. But I just want to briefly go through my philosophy again at the risk of boring those of you who've heard it before. The United Kingdom took thousands of years to create. It is a settled, social, national construct. It comes with a shared language, it comes with a shared history, a shared culture, a shared sense of belonging. And even though we may have our differences between us, whether we're from the left or the right or from one church or another, there's a kind of shared belonging, a shared sense of belonging, a shared worth among us. And that is now being tested to the point of extinction. And the reason I'm in politics is not because I think we need a marginal deviation in the way that the country is governed. I'm in politics because I fear for the very existence of the United Kingdom. We need a 180-degree handbrake turn in the direction that the country is going. There is not a single metric to which I can refer positively. When I look at the economy, we're facing an existential threat. National debt at a post-World War II high. Taxation at a post-World War II high. Mostly done through stealth, so you haven't been able to optically identify how taxes went up, but they are, as a proportion of GDP, at a post-World War II high. GDP per capita, the longest recession we've had since World War II. 8 quarters, GDP per capita has been going down. So we've got nothing to show for all that borrowing, taxation and spending. And this year our deficit is going to be somewhere near about £150 billion. We can't go on printing money, creating it for the government to waste. At some point, people will stop buying British government bonds, and then you have the end of the United Kingdom's economy. So we have our economy in deep trouble. Culturally, we are facing an existential threat. Culturally, that which I described as being a sense of belonging, a shared history and so on, is all under attack. How many of you in this room were brought up to be proud of the British Empire? When I was campaigning in Wellingborough, I went to the politics class and I asked the 30-odd students who were there whether they thought that the country's national wealth was due to the slave trade. About 2/3 of the hands went up. Our culture is being fundamentally assaulted. Our children, this partly addresses the question on why we don't attract the youth, our children are being brought up to believe that our forefathers and our national wealth comes virtually entirely from misdemeanors, from bad behavior, from going abroad, meeting nice people and killing them or subjugating them. Of course, that's not true. Our wealth comes from originating hard work, absolutely right, and that's something I want to come back to. Our wealth comes from the agrarian revolution originally, and then the industrial revolution, the establishing of the English language as the language of the world, the establishing of our common law, which is so brilliant, our common law. miles ahead of what they do in Europe, which has infected our law, and I'm going to come back to that as well. So our culture is under attack. Our children need to be brought up to believe in our history. If they don't believe in their history, if they don't believe that the context of their existence is essentially a good one, how can they believe in the United Kingdom? How can the national construct that is the UK go on existing? Our politicians like to call it the culture war. It's not a culture war. It's fundamentally important to our existence. So our culture is under attack. Our democracy is under attack. We've seen that over the last 25 years. Every time a new quango is set up, every time they say that the OBR is needed so that the budget won't, politicians don't behave badly with the budget, actually what they're doing is taking power away from the elected representatives and vesting it in a group of people who have not been elected and are largely unaccountable. The same applies to the Financial Conduct Authority, which regulates my business. If you go to the Financial Conduct Authority's website, it's got a big rainbow flag on it. What's that got to do with financial probity or the promotion of financial services in the United Kingdom? Absolutely nothing. This is an attack on our democracy. These institutions, these local institutions, as well as global ones, one of which we're trying still to escape from, the European Union, they are anti-democratic. And for reasons which are not entirely clear to me, I've got a good idea of why they've done it, but our leaders, I think the generous interpretation is that our leaders believe that global prosperity is more important than domestic prosperity. They take certainly Rishi Sunak takes his self-validation more on the global stage than he does domestically. And he's not alone. Theresa May was the same. Boris Johnson, I'm afraid, the same. Much preferred rubbing shoulders with Biden and Trudeau and people, though he gives the illusion of being a very capable interlocutor between all the social classes. Actually, Boris Johnson is a Liberal Democrat at heart. And I hope I'm not offending anyone, but that is the truth. And of course, Tony Blair, the famous Metro Liberal who wanted to open up our borders to unbridled immigration. That kind of thought process comes from the belief that the global good is what these leaders should be targeting. They've forgotten that it is the national entity that elected them to which they owe their only responsibility. They hold, if I may speak frankly, they hold you in contempt. They want your vote to get into office, but actually you're a pain in the neck. They want to deliver their agenda. So our democracy is under attack. And our constitution is also under attack. We've been led up the garden path by the Conservative and Labour parties who simply swap power between the two of them. They don't have a different agenda. The Conservative Party manifesto, what they believe in and what they would have this country do, is pretty much the same as the Labour Party. One of the other questions I was asked, which I'm going to address now, is, why don't you attack Labour so much? Well, the Labour Party's approach to existence is pretty much the same as the Tories' approach to existence. It's just the Tories happen to be in office at the moment. And of course, the two most visible attacks on our constitution are not by the failed two-party system, but one, we don't have borders anymore as a country. We have unbridled legal immigration. They talk about the net figure of immigration, which last year was 750,000 people, double from when David Cameron said he was going to reduce it to tens of thousands. My interpretation for why we have DEI, diversity, equality and inclusion, which, let's just remind ourselves what it is the progressive promotion of minorities, whether they be ethnic, religion, of a particular sexual disposition or gender, over and above, and if necessary, therefore, to the detriment of the majority. So anyone running a business, anyone who needs to have an accounting service provided. Anyone, particularly in a regulated business, in the educational establishments, in the armed forces, in the police, in the public sector, will have DEI shoved down their throat. And DEI has two effects. First, it's the embedding of racism in our society. When I grew up, my dad's Punjabi, my mother's born in Isleworth, blonde, blue-eyed, my grandfather fought in the Somme, so I'm half-half. When I grew up, I experienced absolutely no racism in this country at an institutional level. My school promoted me just like it promoted every other child. My university was blind to my colour. When I went to get a job, I had no issues getting a job in the United Kingdom. But sadly, we are now a racist country because of DEI. DEI is reverse racism. It's racism against white people, and we've got to call it out for what it is. That in itself, again, is an affront to the nation state that is the United Kingdom, but it's also, and this is the second and equally important point, massively economically damaging. Because if we're promoting people into jobs, putting them on boards of directors, putting them in the police force, Sadiq Khan said he wants the Met to be at least 40% from ethnic backgrounds. That's the equivalent of saying, which you would not be allowed to say, that at least 60% should be white. If I got up on telly, maybe I can get away with it because I'm brown, but if one of you got up in the public domain and you said 60% of the Met should be white, you'd be branded a racist. But he can get away with it because of DEI. Two-tier policing takes place because of DEI. The armed forces are recruiting people from ethnic minorities over and above their ability to fly a jet, in the case of the RAF, because of DEI. It's dumbing down our country. We need to get back to meritocracy. And the last thing I'll say, before moving across, I probably said that a few times, the last thing I'm going to say, but my mind keeps moving on, is that the net result of everything is the existential threat that we face as a country. It's the removal of aspiration from the British people. It's the inculcation of dependency rather than aspiration. It is the continued wealth redistribution model that they're practicing rather than wealth creation. And everything Reform UK stands for is in opposition to everything I've just talked about. So if this country wants to reverse away from the precipice of the existential disaster on which it is now standing, there is only one party for which to vote, and that is Reform UK. You might not like everything we say, you might not like all of us, but our policy agenda and what we believe in stems entirely from putting the United Kingdom first and putting its people first. All our policies hang off that fundamental foundation block. No. That's less than my allocated time to speak, which is great, because I want to go to questions and answers.
Well, thank you, Ben. That's been an excellent sort of dissertation of all the challenges that we're facing. In terms of what we're going to do now, we're going to take about 20 minutes on questions. We've taken them in advance. People left them wrote paper at the top. What I've tried to do is to sort of consolidate them into themes, and you've touched on most of those themes already. So I'll try and, we might have to avoid certain things because they've already been said. And if we manage to get through these, which I think is quite unlikely, then we can go to the audience. We have a microphone, a roving mic over there, and we'll pick up some additional questions from the audience if we need to. So, without anything else, any more to do, let me just jump straight in, if that's all right. I'm going to start with an easy one. They're not all easy, but we'll start with the easy one.
I may not answer the difficult ones.
Yeah. Some of them, in my own view, are quite contentious, but we're amongst friends. So I think there's nothing wrong with asking a few contentious questions, because if you guys are asking them, we ought to have a chance to talk about them, I think. Anyway, the first one is immigration.
Yeah.
On two parts to this, really. One is there really a practical means of stopping the votes physically? Second part to the question, is there anything we can do to stop the judiciary and the civil service from supporting what is currently going on
In terms of illegal migration.
in terms of illegal migration?
Okay. The biggest threat we have, by the way, is legal migration. It's not illegal migration, but we don't have borders. And at a very fundamental level, we have to absolutely stop illegal migration. And what we've forgotten as a nation state, which our politicians refuse to recognize, and this is Europe-wide, is that borders need to be enforced. There's a reason it's called border force. They're meant to use force at the border. What would happen to you if you rushed at the border force gates, the E-gates at Heathrow, and you tried to jump them? It would be the quickest way to have a very big burly guy wrestle you to the ground, point a gun at the back of your head and handcuff you. But if you come across the channel in a boat, you get escorted to the point of our territorial waters by French Navy. They radio in to Border Force, the glorified border taxi service, who come up, rock up, take you off the dinghy, put a warm blanket around your shoulders, give you a cup of tea, give you a Kit Kat because you deserve a break, bring you to the United Kingdom, put you up in a 4-star hotel. Do you know how much money we spent on? How much? 8 million a day. 5 billion a year. 5 billion, that's 1% of everyone's tax rate here. So when Rishi Sunak says he hasn't got enough money to cut your taxes, that's just the beginning of why. But I mean, he's in gross dereliction of duty not enforcing our borders. Enforcing our borders is very simple. Enforce them. We have a legal international right to enforce our borders. When those dinghies rock up on the point of the territorial waters of the United Kingdom, they're not coming from Somalia. They're not coming from war-torn Syria or Gaza. They're coming from France. And as awful as France is, they should go back to France. Do you know how much money the French spend on illegal migrants per head? How much do they spend on the ones they keep? £5,000 per annum per head. Do you know how much we're spending? £50,000 per annum per head. So when they say that our approach to illegal migration is deterrence, that's not deterrence. We're hanging out a carrot. Please cross the channel. We're so nice in the UK. When they arrive, they get an iPad, they get a translator, they get medical care, dental care, cash in their back pocket, mobile phones, and they complain if they're not happy. Now, the European Union is fundamentally to blame as well. And don't get distracted, for example, by politicians like Maloney, who got elected on a ticket of stopping the boats in the sea. They haven't got the courage to enforce their borders. And you know that because they have something stupid called a Schengen zone. And that is the ultimate. That is where they wanted to take this country and where our elected politicians still want to take us, a borderless world. The Schengen zone is the end of nation states. It ceases. France ceases to exist. Germany ceases to exist. Italy ceases to exist if there are no borders. It's a trap, the Schengen zone. Oh, sure, you can travel across Europe as a student more easily. Is it really worth giving up the United Kingdom so you can take a train across Europe without having to show your passport? If the Schengen zone didn't exist, we wouldn't have trouble at the Channel. We need to enforce our borders. Sorry, I can go on.
I get the feeling you're warmed up.
Yeah.
Next one's okay?
Yeah. Civil service.
Yeah.
Do not be distracted by the accusation that the civil service is holding the government back. That is a construction by ministers for failing to do their job. I keep hearing it's the civil service. Sure, I don't doubt for a second that the civil service are bloody awful. I don't doubt for a second that they want open borders. But for God's sake, who's in charge of the damn civil service? It's the ministers. Get a grip. And part of the reasons the ministers can't get a grip is because, not part of the reason, they don't want to get a grip. They're part of the problem. They're part of the problem. That won't happen if Reform UK is in charge. We will sack any civil servant who doesn't do their job.
And my last role was in the civil service. I was the only Brexiteer there.
Yeah.
And I was the only one that declared to be a Brexiteer there. And the amount of flack I got. Right, so the next one is about what's been going on with our PPCs more recently. And questions around...
Hope not hate.
Sorry?
Hope not hate.
That's down there actually, but
right.
we can address that one as well.
Yeah.
I'll pitch that one. But really, we're talking about the training and vetting of
right.
PPCs. There's a secondary issue here, which I think is quite parochial, if I can put it that way. People are looking at what's going on with the Tory MPs that are showing sort of warning noises towards reform, and obviously with Lee Anderson coming across. There seems to be some level of nervousness around the fact that current PPCs might be dislodged by Tory MPs coming across and picking a prime seat. I'm not sure you can even answer that question.
I am going to answer it.
Okay, so those are the two that I've got for you.
Okay, so let me take the second one first. No Tory MP is any more welcome in reform than anyone else is. The Tories are part of the problem. If they're a Tory MP, they have to ask themselves why it is they haven't done anything about beforehand. I love Suella. You would have heard me on GB News say Suella's brilliant. She talks a great fight, doesn't she? So does Jacob Rees-Mogg. Bloody brilliant, pretty, Patel, spot on. But they didn't walk the walk. Suella's condemnation letter, did anyone read it when she was sacked as Home Secretary? She cited 4 things, not all of which I can remember, but I do recall when I read it, realising that all 4 things had been breached by Rishi within her taking office, within 2 or 3 months of her taking office underneath him. Why hadn't she already resigned? Why hadn't she been shouting it from the rooftops that the Prime Minister is in breach of the promises he'd made her? Why is she still in the Conservative Party? Why is Jacob Rees-Mogg still in the Conservative Party? Why? Well, I mean, they're tribalistic. They are the average Tory MP and the average Labour MP, and this is where they've done so much damage to the first past the post system, is themselves first, party second, country third. The only thing that they worry about is losing their seat. And in my view, and you may have heard me say this, our aim should be to obliterate the Conservative Parliamentary Party. And I think we've succeeded. As far as what was the second one, on PPCs and our vetting process.
Yeah, training and vetting.
Yeah, training and vetting. So this is not something for which I'm directly responsible, but we are an insurgency. We're working on £1 million a year, roughly. That's basically our budget. The Conservative Party is on about 30 odd million a year. So, and we're going from 0 3 years ago to fighting a general election where we're going to stand 630 candidates in Great Britain. We weren't going to stand in Northern Ireland. I'm now talking to Jim Allister, who heads up the Traditional Union Voice in Northern Ireland, to actually stand candidates there too, because the DUP, I'm afraid, if you're familiar with Northern Irish politics, have also become Tories. Yeah. They've basically sold the Northern Irish people down the drain. So we're going to hold... If you could clip anything, clip that. The DUP has sold the Northern Irish people down the drain. Yeah. So we're going to challenge the DUP in Northern Ireland. And when you're an insurgency, it's very hard to have all the infrastructure and all the vetting processes in place. You've got to move at speed. You're moving to meet an emergency, in effect. So we will make mistakes. We won't be as good as the Conservative Party, but, and I answer that hope, not hate, which is actually more like hate, not hope, that organisation. I'll answer that question now. We will make mistakes. And there will be people who we take on who say things, and sometimes they say things after you've vetted them. So they haven't said anything particularly daft, and then, you know, they become parliamentary candidates, and then they go out on a limb, and they say something which, you know, would prevent them from being elected, would prevent this party from going forward positively, and correctly they're removed. And we can debate, you know, what is an acceptable level of affront that they might or something they might say that requires us to remove them. But I can tell you Richard Tice will stand full square behind a candidate that he thinks deserves the party's protection, and so will I. I'm not shy of doing that.
Okay, next one.
Yeah.
So this is about UK exports in particular. Prior to Brexit, our goods exports were around about 375 billion.
To the EU.
To the EU. To the whole world. Okay.
No, 375 I think is to the EU.
Okay.
It was 100 billion greater than services, which the BBC and the institution never tell you.
Yeah.
Being number 11 on the planet, why are we not promoting British goods? The police drive foreign cars. TV cameras spying on us.
Yeah.
Let me add
Yes,
to this. Let me carry on adding to this particular one, because the sort of direction of travel on this particular question is regarding the government and civil services sending the wrong message. Now, I can tell you from my time of leaving the civil service 2 years ago that they were still planning to run the OJU process for the next 10 years up on major construction projects out to 2035.
Yeah.
So within government, with my own eyes, I've already challenged that why are we still continuing to work in a way which we should be free from as a result of Brexit. So that, I think, is the same issue.
Okay, so when we left the EU, we signed the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. I've touched on it. And Boris Johnson, in his wisdom, Lord Frost, who speaks so brilliantly now, if you'd heard Lord Frost, you'd think he might actually believe in Brexit. But he signed us up to a level playing field on state aid. And competition. And what that basically means is that our government can't issue contracts in favour of British firms ahead of EU member state firms. They have to be invited on a tender, on an equal footing through a tender process. The only preferential treatment we can give British firms are in areas of national importance, defence, building a ship maybe, or something like that, an aircraft carrier without any jet fighters, that kind of thing. So we have, as we were exiting the door, as the British people saw, shouldn't we be so proud that the British people saw we should leave that filthy organisation? They knew it, we know it. And as we were exiting, they grabbed us and pulled us back in. So the reason we can't have complete freedom to buy British first, and Boris kept saying, I'm going to buy British first. Do you remember? We can't do it under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. Sorry, was there another part to the question?
No, that's I think we
yeah.
covered it all.
But just to address your question, one of the brilliant things that Brexit offered up was the opportunity to kill the £100 billion trade deficit that we have with the EU, roughly. £100 billion, because the EU has a currency that is artificially cheap. It has a cheap currency because the southern states have pulled it down. Germany is the only real economic driver. By the way, Germany's in real trouble at the moment. But Germany has typically been the economic driver of the European Union. It has an artificially low exchange rate. Its whole economic model is based on exports. So when we were stuck in the EU, we were effectively being held captive by Germany that was stuffing its goods down our throat on a cheap exchange rate, principally cars. And having left, if we'd left properly, we would have been able to address that trade deficit. We would have been able to take the fight to the German economy. But we haven't done it. We're still running a big deficit with Germany. And of course, folks, that's very bad for the UK if we're losing 100 billion in foreign exchange every year. That means the pound is consistently under pressure because we're buying more goods into this country than we're exporting. And the city does make up for some of it because the city is prolific, though it is too. We can talk about the city. The city itself is at the moment suffering greatly because it's not being freed up to do what it needs to do for the United Kingdom. We're not taking advantage of the freedoms that Brexit gave us to liberate the city, to deregulate the city, and take the fight to Frankfurt and Paris, which, by the way, are minnows compared to London. But I fear that we'll give up London unless they get a grip of this promptly.
Okay, swiftly moving on, policing. So, in fact, a lot of comments were about the state of the police, particularly around the woke agenda, everything that we've witnessed in London with Sadiq Khan trying to control the Met at the moment and things like that. What's the plans?
Yeah, so the police are hijacked by DEI, the Diversity, Equality and Inclusion Training. The police are told that they need to cut slack for those from disadvantaged, ethnic minorities and so on. It's not woke. Can I just say, woke isn't a social fad. Woke is a government policy. Woke is DEI. That's what woke is. Woke is DEI. It's the progressive, they call it progressive, another hijacking of the English language. There's nothing progressive about putting forward the rights of a particular group of people because they have immutable physical characteristics that differentiate them from the rest. That's not progressive. That's massively regressive. But woke is DEI, and the police are subject to DEI. And so the police have lost they've lost the understanding of what it means to police without fear, without favour. I don't know if you read I'm going to digress very slightly, but it's completely pertinent, that the Sentencing Commission advocated a few days ago that there should be more lenient sentences for people who come from disadvantaged backgrounds. They are absolutely, they're advocating for a two-tier judicial system. How can our criminal justice system operate if some people are let off the hook and others aren't? What does that famous statue above the Old Bailey have around her eyes? It's a blindfold. Our forefathers, who get trashed all the time, understood that justice has to be blind, that you can't single out particular groups of people. And then there are a couple of other things. The police spend all their time behind desks, ticking boxes, doing bureaucracy, they're not on the beat. The police are now going to be distracted by hate crime law, they're going to be distracted by the Online Harms Act, policing the internet rather than going out and actually doing their job. The police have been hollowed out. Reform UK will put another 40,000 police officers on the beat, on the front line, not in the offices. And then the other thing, another form of hijacking of the English language, and I hope I'm driving the point home about how damaging it is to hijack the English language, is the expression petty crime. Have you heard of the expression petty crime? There's no such thing as petty crime, there's crime. If you break the law, you suffer the consequences. It's not petty. The reason they say it's petty is because they don't want to enforce it. And the minute they decide they're not going to enforce it, you're encouraging criminality. There is no innocence in stealing a loaf of bread. The price of bread goes up for everyone. When a car gets stolen, the price of insurance goes up for everyone. But the police won't enforce those crimes. They'll give you a claim number if your car's, you can get your money from the insurance, and they think it's a victimless crime. It isn't. So we've got to go, I'm afraid we've got to go full tilt. It's very, very difficult when Pandora's box is open, and the criminal justice system is a bit of a it's a bit of a confidence trick, criminal justice system. It's got to convince criminals not to be criminal. Because if all 68 million people in this country decided to be criminal, no number of police officers would be able to control them. It's a confidence trick. It's getting people to believe that if they break the law, they're going to be caught and they're going to be punished. And if you lose that confidence, if the criminals think, actually we've got the better of this system, like the people crossing the channel think, they think they can come in, we're not going to stop them, and they're right. If the criminals think they can get away with it, we're inviting criminality. And that's where we've gone wrong as a country. We're inviting criminality, and we've got to go back.
You can see it in America. It was a two-part question, but I'm going to add a third line on this one. And we're talking about education. So, wanting to understand if there's a position regarding the expansion of continuation of grammar schools, point number one. Point number two is to do with, do we have any plans or thoughts around student debt and how that is addressed within the UK population? And thirdly, I would like to know what our plans are to deal with the gender ideology that's going through our infant and junior schools.
Okay, I'm going to take the third part first, if I may. I might need to ask you to remind me what the other two were. But the reason there are very few young people in the audience today is because they've been hijacked. And anyone under the age of about 30 or 35 even has probably been subjected to critical race theory, subjected to transgender ideology, subjected to the false narrative that we're all descendants of slave traders and racists. And the first thing Reform UK has to do, and it's critical, is debug the educational system. If our children are brought up that way, there is no going, it's very difficult. You can't go back. I love my daughter. She's a first-class human being. She was absolutely behind Brexit when she was 16. Then she went to, when we voted in 2016, she was 15, I think, actually. She was completely behind Brexit. Then she went to Bristol University to do zoology. And Mimi, bless her soul, who I love dearly, says, "Daddy, why are you saying all this nonsense? The planet is going to burn up. We are in dire straits. We've got to reverse from this massive damage we're doing to the climate. Brexit, stop talking about Brexit, Daddy." And that's what happens. So we've got to reclaim our youth. What was the
Grammar schools.
Grammar schools. So the Labour policy and the Conservative policy, when it comes to trying to change behaviour in society, they do two things. They regulate you, put a noose around your neck, you can't move, tie you up in stuff, or they throw money at a problem. Our approach, on the whole, is to incentivize you to do things, incentivize people to do things. Now, you can take the pressure off the state system by actually giving tax benefits to those who send their children to the private educational establishments. So give them tax relief on what they pay on school fees. Labour's approach is to charge VAT on private education. And we're not talking about Eton and Harrow and Winchester here. We're talking about many, many good private schools across the country, stripping away the ability of parents to send their children there by increasing their school fees by 20% because of VAT. What's going to happen to the state sector? It's going to be overwhelmed. And of course, playing into all of this is immigration. If you've got immigration at the rate that we've got, 1.5% per annum, 1.5% per annum, 1.25% per annum, our population is going up. That's going to burden the educational sector. It's going to burden, I'm going to digress for a second, it's going to burden the NHS, it's going to trouble the police, it's going to burden housing. Everything comes under pressure when the country is growing at the rate it is in terms of population, but not wealth. And we will not become a wealthy nation if we practice daft policies like DEI, taxation rather than wealth redistribution, taxation, spending and wealth redistribution rather than wealth creation. We've got, as I said earlier, and I've said a number of times, we need a 180-degree change. So the way we would sort out the educational establishments is to create the growth in the economy that can fund the state sector, but not drive people out of the private sector. Make it worthwhile. And while I'm on the private sector, give people tax relief on private insurance that they take for health. Why not? Take them out of the NHS.
Very good, very good. I can understand it, but I think it's maybe this will be open to a lot of opinion. There's a view that our slogan that says "Make Britain Great," written on my things over there, is a little bit too Donald Trump and a bit too sort of right-wing, and in terms of our marketing materials, in terms of our the image and the messages that we want to try and penetrate through. Has there been any discussions around that?
I think we should make Britain great, and we should be unashamed of it.
Completely the wrong impression. Of course I agree with it, but it really won't help you.
No.
People will think you're Trumpy.
Yep.
Urgently, I used to work at Saatchi & Saatchi, right at the Conservative campaign. Urgently recommend you change it.
Okay, I'm just going to address that. So the gentleman was saying so the gentleman was saying that it's going to damage our public standing having something as Trumpian as Make Britain Great. I just want to say two things. The first is when we started our, or Richard did before I joined the party even, started with this kind of backdrop. None of the political parties had the Union Jacks behind them. Even Flipping Starmer's got the Union Jack now behind him when he speaks. They're beginning to realise. And what we need to do is make the nation proud of the Union Jack again. We've got to want the United Kingdom to do well. We still are Great Britain. And Northern Ireland, don't forget Northern Ireland. And, so what I say to those who say you're Trumpian, I'm saying, if you forgive me, sir, you're giving in to the lefties. Don't give in to them. What we have to do, in order to debug the accusation that we're extreme right wing, who in this room thinks of themselves as extreme right wing? Any racists in the room? In order to debug that narrative, we just have to keep saying what we say, stick to it rigidly. We want the United Kingdom to do well. We're proud of the United Kingdom. We're going to reward hard work. We're going to put aspiration back into life. We're going to grow our economy. We're going to settle the culture of the United Kingdom. We're going to champion the English language. We're going to enforce our borders. We're going to spend on defence. Just keep putting that message out there, and eventually they will get the message.
You have 10 slogans there, better than the one you've got.
Well, I don't think so.
We can be very creative if we try. Okay, we're within the last 5 minutes.
Yes, exactly.
The Industrial Revolution, which brought the railways and everything else to the world, and we was built up, and I'm an ordinary working class boy, yeah, and I'm telling you straight now, that title, since I've been born, and my grandfather and my father, has been Great Britain. And why should we be ashamed to turn around and say, from now on, we will be called Britain, not Great Britain? Yeah? You tell an American to stop calling America America and just call it whatever else. No, shoot them. So why should we lose our identity? Why? Why?
All I would like to say is that we're all on the same side, and this is all healthy discussion. It's not someone trying to put us in a box.
No, you just want the best possible message, and I totally understand that. Absolutely right.
Pro-reform.
Yeah.
I think Trump is a lunatic.
Yeah. But can I just say, my debate, when I joined Reform UK, I said to Richard, I'm not happy with Make Britain Great. And he said, well, why not? And Anne Widdecombe wasn't happy with Make Britain Great either, but for different reasons, because it doesn't include Northern Ireland. And then I satisfied myself on the point, because actually the British Isles includes Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, England, and this really wins it for me, includes the Republic of Ireland. So when we talk about the British Isles, we can snook a hook at the blooming Republicans, nationalists south of the border. Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
Okay.
I mean, that's,
Did you hear that?
yeah, that's another valid.
The indication is that Britain is not great, but we've got to make it great, which is
Yeah.
wrong.
I mean, my.
I think Let's Save Britain is a far more effective slogan.
Well, I'll pass it up the chain.
Okay, we are virtually out of time now, folks. So what I want to do, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to go to the last question I've got up here. I've got 4 that we're not going to cover, Ben, because I think we just do the one.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't mind staying if... Do people want me to answer questions? Yes! I don't mind staying if you're happy to stay.
No,
Yeah, okay.
Okay, let me get on to I can see a level of importance to these questions. So there's one that we definitely need to get to, and that is really, how are we planning to fund the adjustments in personal tax allowances?
Yes.
Now that's the easiest question to answer on the planet. One of our members, Richard, couldn't make Newsnight on the 26th of February. Richard couldn't make Newsnight. It was a Monday. We announced our policies on the 24th. And I couldn't make Newsnight either. So someone someone from Reform UK, but maybe someone here went on Newsnight that night. Anyway, someone did. And they said, we're going to save £150 billion per annum. And Newsnight laughed at him. And he was right, and they were wrong. The easiest way to fund, it's very easy to fund all our policy initiatives. You do it by ditching net zero. According to our policy document, that saves 30 billion a year. By my own estimate, actually, I think it's more like 60 billion a year. And I need to challenge Richard on that. I think the figure is underestimating the damage that net zero is doing. It's more like 60. Then the other thing that we're doing, which no other country in the world has done, do you remember all the printing of bonds that we did to lock us up at home? The printing of money, financing government expenditure, the Bank of England effectively buying gilts. Do you remember that? Yeah. 500 billion to lock us up at home, 250 billion to save the banks, and actually in total now we've printed 900 billion pounds worth of debt. That's what we've done, financed by the Bank of England. In the USA, Europe, Japan, they all did the same thing, and the cash that they created for the banking system didn't carry any interest because the banks got this money effectively ex gratia from the government. Now guess what we're doing with the cash that we've put in the banks as a result of buying? We are paying interest on those bank deposits. And depending on where the interest rate is, it's somewhere between 30 and 50 billion a year now. And we're the only country in the world that is paying interest on it. And Andrew Bailey and the Chancellor and the government, they won't reverse, because in order to reverse, they would have to show how bloody stupid they've been. And so they won't do it. So there's another 30 to 50 billion saving, so north of 100. Stop illegal migration, that's 5 billion a year. Cut government waste, get rid of all those DEI departments. You can see yourself to 150 billion in 2 seconds flat, can't you? But here's the thing. I had a debate with Richard about this too. I said, Richard, don't put in all the savings about how we're going to fund all these tax cuts. And he said, well, why not, Ben? Because people will accuse us of not funding our agenda. I said, but the agenda doesn't have to be funded. This is the point. If you cut taxes on the working and middle class, if you cut taxes on private enterprise, you promote growth in the economy. And the Exchequer will collect more tax. The Exchequer at the moment collects 278 or 280 billion, let's say, in income tax, okay, for the 25 million people who are working. You can do the maths, what is that? 200, works out at about £10,000 per head, right? 250 divided by 25 million who are working. We spend 80 billion a year on the 5 million people who are not working. Okay, so when you take someone out from benefits and put them into the work market, you save 12 or 13,000 pounds per head, and the Exchequer makes 12,000. It's a 25,000 pound shift for the Exchequer. It's not that we can't afford to cut taxes, it's that we can't afford not to cut taxes. We have to cut taxes. And it's got to be cut on the working and middle classes. Work has to pay. You've got to make it worthwhile to work. People say Margaret Thatcher. I'm not going to be an apologist for Margaret Thatcher, for whom I had a very high regard. But Margaret Thatcher, they say Margaret Thatcher got inflation under control, then she cut taxes. That is not right. Margaret Thatcher's first budget cut the basic rate of tax from 33% to 30% and the higher rate of tax from 80% to 60%. Look it up, May 1979. The first thing she did was make it pay to work, because she knew she had to get Britain moving forward. And that's where this Chancellor hasn't got a flipping clue. So even though we can fund all our tax cuts, we don't actually need to fund them. They will be self-funding.
Okay, last question. Literally 60 seconds on this.
Okay.
Local housing, the housing crisis that we've got, I think in general the optics to those of us in the room see lots of immigrants that are being prioritised over local people. What's the solution for getting our local people into housing?
So I heard Paul give a very good exposition of the problem. And he's clearly not just a hairy arse builder. You know, that's how he described himself. I mean, it's a multiple. You know, the other thing about the youth of today, of course they're going to feel disenfranchised if they can't get on the housing ladder. If they've got no aspiration, they can't save enough money to pay the deposit to buy a house. And the reason that we're not building enough houses is, well, how can we build enough houses if the population of the country is going up by 750,000 a year? That's another 200,000 houses a year. We typically, at the best point since World War II, we didn't build more than 300,000 a year. And we're building about 200,000 a year at the moment. That doesn't even cope with the net migration figures. So immigration is it's incapable of being addressed. The burden it puts on the housing market is incapable of being addressed because of immigration. But what we need to do is cut planning regulations. I'm sure Paul would agree with that. I'm also a property developer. I haven't checked whether my arse is hairy or not. When I first went into business in the early 90s, it would cost me, I don't know, a couple of grand to get an outline planning permission to build, you know, some houses on a 1 acre plot. Now it costs £150,000. And it's because you've got to get a noise survey, arboreal survey, you've got to get carbon emission things, you've got to check whether the newts in the ground are going to be, you know, made extinct. You've got to do a whole load of stuff, all of which has been imported from the European Union. Yeah, unless, or you're Angela Rayner and you can buy two things and live one way. So it's cut back immigration. So much of our economic problems will be addressed simply by cutting back immigration. And that's not racist, it's just a fact. Cut back immigration. And deregulate planning.
Ben, we've come to the end of our session on the Q&A. So at this point, I'd just like to thank you again for all of your commitment to this, and I'm sure all these folks are feeling incredibly motivated here. Now, I'm sorry